Welcome into the Diamond Sun, where we bring the bright future into the present.
As we face many intimidating realities, we want to hear from and be inspired by people who either have journeyed or who have an educated hypothesis on how to travel from the dark night into a better world. On today's podcast, Susie Herrick and myself, Elle Luna, are going to have a casual chat, as two friends do, before we bring on the roster of guests that we have lined up for this season. Let's dive into our first podcast, a conversation between Susie Herrick and Elle Luna. We hope you enjoy. Can I ask the first question? I wrote my little questions on little pieces of paper and I balled them up. I'm going to pull one out. Here we go. Shake, shake, shake. Okay, opening it. Yes, I was so hoping this one would be first. Okay. A friend sent me a quote by the artist, the musician Nick Cage. And he is a really interesting person for a number of reasons. But he wrote a book called Faith, Hope, and Carnage. And this is a quote from his book. Hope is optimism with a broken heart. This means that hope has an earned understanding of the sorrowful or corrupted nature of things, yet it rises to attend to the world even still. We understand that our demoralization becomes the most serious impediment to bettering the world. In its active form, hope is a supreme gesture of love, a radical and audacious duty, whereas despair is a stagnant rejection of life itself. Hope becomes the energy of change.
It reminds me of Pandora's box. Right? When she opens the box, all this horror comes out. And then this little being comes out. It's hope. Like she sees all the horrors, but then this last little thing is hope. So yes, I love it, the brokenheartedness of it. And I think that you and I both really share that brokenheartedness.
Okay, can we unpack this?
Yeah.
So in full disclosure, I'm chewing on this. I'm reading this book by Deb Ozarko called Beyond Hope. The whole first half of the book is called Asleep. And it's all about all of the reasons to be hopeless. All of the, sixth great mass extinction. I've wanted to send you this book so many times. I need to finish it before I do. But it's just about, the lie of the American dream, our culture of addiction, social media, our technology. We have technology to help us, manage the incredible complexity of humanity, of the ecosystem of the world. Yet humans are still ravenous. The way that we subsume other species. I mean, it goes on and on. And by the end of the asleep section, you're feeling like this, I mean, she basically says the last chapter of the first part is called It's Over. And she talks about the importance of the process of going through the grief of realizing that it's over, that we're in planetary hospice, is what she calls it. And there are all of these reasons, like the trajectory of this, the trajectory of that. None of it looks good. And when I read it, it makes sense. However, she's talking a lot about detachment, like detach from your hopium, detach from your belief, that you're going to change or fix or save the world, that's just actually an impediment. And it's interesting because I'm struggling with this book because she seems pretty attached to despair or attached to a certain outcome. The Nicolas Cage quote so spoke to me because it's like what you've said before, be joyful despite all the facts. Like things are what Deb writes they are. All of that checks out for me. And I do still feel that I have a note to play. I do still feel that I have something to contribute. Do I know how it's going to turn out? Do I know how the movie is going to end? I don't. There's so many ways that it could go. And I do think there's an important process around feeling all of the grief of what's happening to our planet and to us as a species. And okay, last thing, and then I want to hear how all this sits with you. I've had like weeks to think about this. Sorry. I went to a death cafe in San Francisco many years ago, and it was at the Zen Hospice Center. And we sat in a circle, and they went around the circle, and they said, introduce your name and, what your death date is, if you know it. Like, what an introduction. Like, hi, I'm, so-and-so. I have 3 months. Hi, I'm so-and-so. I have 12. Almost everyone in the circle knew when they were going to die. And it was kind of one of the first times I realized, oh, I'm a part of this group also. I just don't know what the day is or how yet. And at the end of the session, after the person next to me said that she has 3 months and she's going to write postcards to everyone she loves. And then someone else on the other side of the circle, she's going to travel. She just wants to see all the beautiful places that she never got to see when she, before. And it got to me and I thought, well, what would I do if I only had 3 months? At the end of the death cafe, the gentleman who was facilitating this group, he said, have a good night. And I just want to plant the seed. If you're somebody who doesn't know your death date, what would you do if you had more time? And if you do have time, go do that thing. I've only finished the asleep part, but I hope where she's going with this is what is the thing that you would do if you were looking at the end? Because it might be governed by different rules, right? How I would spend my week this week would be very different if I knew that I didn't have next week. And I wonder if what she's saying is like, go do that thing. Whatever that is, where that comes from. I mean, we have to like sing for our supper to live on this planet. And how do we make more space for the thing that you would do if you had no more time? And is that the very nature of the thing that we need to get us out of this planetary crisis? Although now I'm attached again to a possible outcome. Anyway, I'm just going to throw all this out there.
Wow. That's incredible. Just to let you know, the be joyful despite knowing all the facts is from an Oliver Wendell Holmes poem. That's where that comes from. Yeah. I think that you're touching on the very thing that really is at the hearts of a lot of people. How do I find hope and yet knowing all that I know? And that's really the challenge. And I, years of my life I've spent trying to figure that out. How do we have hope? I mean, even when, we were doing stuff in the 70s just on nuclear power plants and knowing how they could just devastate an entire state and how many they wanted to build, it just seemed like we were doomed even then. And then nuclear weapons. And then, of course, knowing how population works, 1980 was 4.5 billion, and now we would have 8 billion. And how different the world is. It's really crowded everywhere. And so, and at that time, they didn't think we would survive having a lot of people. So but at the same time, I feel like there's a lot of ingenuity out there. And I remember 79, 80, I was only planning my life a couple years in advance. And Marilyn Nyborg handed me a story because I was feeling really doomed. And it was a story about how the youth in the future had figured out how to work with matter so they could change everything, right? And clean up the pollution. And I thought, as I now look at all the AI stuff, that's possible. So who knows? But I love Harrison Ford's line, Han Solo, when he says, "Don't tell me the odds." Love that line. But I am very aware of, like, especially with the Los Angeles fires right now and the death of my brother, that we are, very much, life is very much like a Tibetan sand painting. You spend a lot of time making this beautiful thing, and it can get blown away by the wind. And that's the weird thing about life. Tomorrow's not guaranteed, but death isn't guaranteed for a while either. So how do you sit with both? So I don't know, but I am encouraged by collective intelligence.
Say more about that.
Um, well, part of my inspiration for the podcast is to get collective intelligence around what we can do about this and how we can step into the future, a utopian future. And so, this idea that people can collectively come up together with something very bright, because there's a lot of people involved. They've done interesting studies. I don't know the name of I should probably not quote this, but I'll quote it anyway. There was a study where they couldn't find a ship, sunken ship. So they interviewed all these people on the coastline and to ask them about where they think it might be. And they put all the data together and got within like 10 feet of it or something. And I feel like if we can interview a lot of people to see how we can get from, which feels like the dark night, the what you were talking about, that sense of, just looking at the species, the loss of species, right? That's just horrible. Like when we were kids, life was very different. Just the amount of insects, there's hardly any insects like there used to be. And so, but how do you look at that and then take the intelligence of as many people as possible and say, okay, what do we need to do? And I know that a lot of people right now feel really scared about, the new presidency and what's going to happen, because there's not a bent towards trying to save the environment. And so there does feel very dire right now. And yet at the same time, I'm curious to see what happens with AI, especially. Like, could AI save us, or could it destroy us? Who knows?
There's a podcast called The Emerald, and one of the episodes is called Fire, and it's all about, in sort of this mytho-poetic way, the history of fire and the poetry of fire and the animism of fire. And he says in the podcast, and I've been wondering if fire is artificial intelligence. He says in the podcast, and so it is, that all around us lives the very thing that could warm us, feed us, nourish us, set us on the path of cultural illumination, and also the very same thing that could burn it all to the ground, tricks on us. He was talking about fire as the trickster, and how the trickster always has two sides.
Yeah.
And it remains to be seen. All possibilities are on the table. Yeah. And we just spoke with an expert in artificial intelligence about helping us understand what those options are and what the timeline is for those, and what we would need to do to get to be on a more sure-footed, safer path for humanity and all species. Is there anything else you want to add about hope? I feel like we could talk for a decade about hope. And well, actually, maybe I do have a question about hope. I was recently reading the book, The Thirst for Wholeness by Christina Groff. She was the former wife of Stan Groff. And she talked about how she suffered from alcoholism, and she talked about how you're not ready to recover until you have unequivocally given up hope. And I'm holding that as I'm reading this book, Beyond Hope, and I'm really grappling with this. If I were to do a parallel metaphor, that our own addictions as a species, I'll use myself. I'm not taking bucket baths. I'm running clean drinking water for longer than it is necessary to, take a shower, or lights are on that don't need to be on, you know, I can just easily look around how I live. It's just not sustainable. And I think about, like, do we have to come to a point where, like you, we stop planning 2 to 3 years out? Is that an important part of the process of fully descending all the way into the possibility of the dark night before you can turn a corner into, you know, what Christina Groff called recovery?
Well, I think you're talking about the stuff around sobriety because, you know, the addict goes, yeah, I can do this. I can sustain this. This is no problem. I can drink and I can have a little bit to drink. And there's all this sort of mythology that they have around what they can do with alcohol. And the sober moment is realizing that they're not in control. They don't have any control. And so that's the hope, is that I can do this without worrying about it, or not, you know, like that's the hope. It depends on what you're hoping for, right? And I think the sober moment, like in the Enneagram for the 7, that sober moment, which is I'm taking all this stuff in, but it's not getting me anywhere. And I think that's sort of like the letting go of the hope of the false god. And I think the hope that we're talking about is, it's like when you're looking at all the things that humans do and the way that they are on the planet and how their behavior is not sustainable, like you were saying about the water or whatever, right? Is there going to be a point where we're going to get smart enough to remedy that in some way, collectively? Because right now there's so many factions, right? So in my lifetime, that's been a big issue, right? It's like watching people wanting nuclear weapons just so they can be part of the power game, but without the intention of using them, but with always the threat. Because if I threaten to annihilate you and annihilate me at the same time, that's the ultimate way to win a power struggle. But really deep down, I think we have to evolve to a point where we can start collectively, trusting each other. But it's very difficult when you have a rather large faction of the population that believes in winning above everything. And so an individual winning. So if you have individual winning, that's the thing, then you can't work in harmony and nobody can trust you. So that, I think, is our biggest challenge. It's the psychopathy of the human being. And I think until we really grapple with that, because any government, any really good intentioned person to try to rule or to try to do things, once they have that personality that believes in psychopathy, then no matter what you do, it's always going to be ruined by that.
Can you define psychopathy or psychopath?
Well, there's a disorder in the DSM called antisocial personality disorder. And it's basically a person that doesn't have morals. And their drive is to gain, power, or to gain something, to win or to do something. And they have this incredible sense, I believe, of emptiness. And so they're like hungry ghosts, and they just go around and try to achieve more and more. Right.
And the hungry ghost, for those of you who don't know what it is a beautiful, well, it's not beautiful. I think it's a beautiful image. I've seen it in some murals, actually, that photographs of murals that Susie took when she was visiting an underground community in Italy called Domenher. And there are these beautiful paintings of these seas.
That's the enemy. That's the enemy. That's different.
Oh.
Yeah, it's different, which I appreciate you bringing that up. The enemy is different. Hungry ghost is a Tibetan Buddhist term for creatures that are stuck in this kind of state after death where they want something, but they don't have the capacity to get it. So they're constantly going through it for it. It's like a ghost that wants to eat food, but can't, has this very thin pencil neck and can't, bring in the food.
Yes. So that's the image of this little head that's way up high above the neck and shoulders. And then this long, long neck where nothing can actually fit through it. And then this big empty belly. And I love this image. It's almost like these giraffe people, and they're so hungry, and they have this little neck, and really. Okay, yeah. So those are hungry ghosts, and so hungry ghosts, you're saying is like the emptiness that accompanies
Insatiable part of
psychopathy.
us. There's never enough, you know. And so it basically gets it's greed. Greed is often part of that, which is you think, oh, if I just have this, it'll make me better somehow. And I think that what we all really crave is love, even though some of us are closer to that than others. So I feel like we've got to figure out how to deal with this thing called psychopathy in humans. And because that alone, that need that need for greed. There's an old Tibetan myth that this king, it's a story that a king went to one of his Rinpoches and said, I have a block of gold and I'm going to have a party and I want you to go around and interview people at the party to see who really feels like they need the block of gold the most. So the Rinpoche goes around to all these people and then eventually ends up at the king's feet and puts the block of gold in front of him. And he's like, what are you doing? He said, you're the person in the room that just feels like you need it the most.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's, and no offense against, J.K. Rowling and Oprah, but I remember a conversation the two of them were having. Oprah was interviewing her, and they were talking about how both of them are billionaires and how it still doesn't feel like enough. And so it's, and that part of us, I think we need to take a look at, because usually I think when like any government starts, that type of personality seeks to take over and use their power, but they act like, walk like, talk like, the people that are in it. And then eventually they just take over because that's their goal, is the power, not to govern. And so we have
If
to, sorry.
if that's the most important thing that we need to do, how do we do that?
Well, I was kind of hoping to interview somebody that could give us an answer. I mean, generally, we'd have to figure out how to assess for it, because people that are antisocial or, are technically psychopathic or sociopathic, and some would argue that's all the same thing. They're hard to detect because they're so good at looking like part of the party. And then because they're so charismatic and I know exactly what to say. There's a really interesting book called The Sociopath Next Door, and I can't remember the name of the author right now, but she interviews all these people and even psychiatrists who are psychopaths, how chilling it is. So we need to, I think, figure out a way to assess for this in the human race so that we can work with it, as opposed to have it constantly working against us.
We had the fantasy a couple months ago of maybe artificial intelligence can help us identify psychopaths and keep them out of office.
Yeah, Steve was talking about that, that type of assessment. And I wouldn't know how to do it, but I'd be really interested in it, because I think generally it's in everybody's best interest. Like even for the psychopath, it's in their best interest, because oftentimes when that type of personality ends up contained and unable to harm, they relax. So there's something there that I think, they can be incredibly dangerous, but at the same time, they have a lot of energy and they have, they're pioneer type character. But at the same time, they can be, ruin everything. So it's how to work with that. I think in general, for all the therapists out there, I think personality disorders, especially what they call cluster B, which is narcissistic, antisocial, borderline, are the top three of those. There's a couple more in there, but those are the top three. I think we have to learn how to assess for them more appropriately so that they can't wreak so much havoc. So, and I just like, one of the women who's had an NDE, near-death experience, she talks about how she went to, Nancy Reines. She talks about how she went to a wild horse sanctuary to heal. And there was a beautiful horse there. And the horse normally was standoffish, but somehow sensed something in her and came down and put its head on her chest. But she mentioned the past of this horse had been owned by this horrible person who tortured it. So it had scars all over its body. And it's like that kind of person, the torturers, we need to figure out, where they are so that they, stop. So it's just that kind of thing. But I think that on a massive scale, that's the biggest issue we've got, is that part of us, that part of our personality that's that way.
Mm.
Because you can sort of see what happens to organizations when someone like that takes over. And they take over and they do it quickly and they know how to do it. It happened to the school that I was working at. It's very they're very clever, and trying to understand their motivation is really hard. But they just go around destroying things, or they just go around taking ownership and causing pain.
That could be a whole chapter in Deb Ozarko's book.
Yeah.
Psychopathy. She does talk about it. Her statements are a little bit more earth shaking. She says, like, we are all insane. We are all psychopaths. She says, just look at the way we live, the way we consume. Hers, it's a bit more all inclusive.
Yeah. I could see why she would say that. And I could also say that there's a lot of sanity out there. I think we have to deal with that we're animals. And how do we take that into account? And then still, find a way through this time so that we don't destroy everything. And a lot of people talk, the earth is going to be fine, and we'll just die off. And it's like, well, that's such a grim thought, such a failure thought. And I think, Neil deGrasse Tyson, he said something very wise. He said, hey, if we can think about terraforming Mars, we should be able to fix the planet. And I think he's right.
I do think there is some value, though, in imagining the worst case scenario, like really feeling it all. I mean, you're someone who it's sort of choicelessly been with you your whole life. You've always felt like, what's going on? How do we live this way? It's been sort of ever present for you. And I would say for me, it hasn't been ever present for me. And then as I slowly began, looking at what was going on and putting the pieces together, it arrived a little bit later and a little bit slower. And it's frightening to go down some of those pathways. But I will say it's also been very energizing in that way. We're talking about fire. There is some, I don't know, there's some energy that comes from really going down the path you don't want to go down, and like feeling into what that would be. Yes, the earth would recover, but what would it mean to lose humanity as one of the species on this planet? A lot would be lost. There's so many wonderful things about being here.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is getting to that point of sobriety, that an addict does. Like, you have to get to that point of like, wow, this is not working anymore at all. And I may die from this, right? So, I mean, I think you're saying is very wise, which is that, we have to wake up and see that what we're doing is not working. And I was raised to know this, when I first was a kid and I was working in the nuclear stuff, or even reading the Global 2000 report, which was a report that Jimmy Carter commissioned and Gerald Barney did, about what the world would be like in the year 2000. And it was like everything that pretty much was written in there came true. I would say that knowing all that, like knowing, the devastation, people, it's like, I don't think people realize what one nuclear bomb causes, right? Or what it looks like when you lose a certain level of species. Like the bees are a great example. If we lose the bees, we could all just die from that. That's just extraordinary, but that's how the web of life works. And so the sobriety of that, like waking up and going, oh, wow, okay, I got to figure that one out. And hopefully in time, And that's the point of how to establish like the intelligence of the whole species. Because right now, the people that are ruling the ruling class right now, a lot of them have shown that they don't have any understanding of that. And if they do, they just don't care. Otherwise, they put all of their efforts into it. So it is strange. Like, what is that about us? It's like, you know, how people must have felt on the Titanic when they realized that, you know, what do I do? And it could have been stopped. And it's so scary. It's really scary. Like, it's really scary. I mean, I really want to say that what we face is terrifying. And what you talk about hope is that the energy in that is once I've realized the problem, then possibly there's a solution. And hospice is a pretty intense word to put the whole world in, and it's possible that it isn't in a hospice state. But even when someone's in hospice, it's like this feeling of, you know, is this real? It's very surreal to be in hospice. So I'm hoping.
I was thinking we're not really in planetary hospice. Maybe we're in like the planetary ICU or the planetary ER where we're in bad shape. But who knows? I just don't think we know.
I can't remember who originally said that we're like a cancer on the planet. And so how do we basically, what interventions do we need to change that?
Can I change gears just a little bit?
Please. Yeah.
So you're a therapist, and if you had, well, actually, I have some friends who are therapists, and one of the things that they were sharing was how hard it is when clients come in and who are feeling all of this, and they want to feel better, and those are my words, not theirs, but I wonder how many therapists feel like people are having very normal responses to what's going on of sadness or loneliness. That's actually a very healthy response to an abnormal situation. However, you're a therapist. What do you do? Like, imagine if a client came in who was grokking all this. Like, where do you go from here? And maybe this can lead us into the title of the podcast.
Well, on a whole, I think therapists are incredibly empathetic and very wise. That's been my experience. And I've taught thousands of them. And I'm very impressed with that population of people. So I just had to say that. If a client comes in with that type of despair, what do you do with that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Like,
I think
from here?
validation is a key one. You know, it's a very real experience to come to this. And so that to me is like the sober moment, right? When she says you have to, you know, you hit the rock bottom, the hopelessness. Now, to me, what the podcast is about is how to take a look deeply at the dark night that we're in, the dark pyramid of the past, as they say. But I also know, like, you know, when you talk about, you're the one who told me about butterflies, and that when a caterpillar goes into that state where it builds a cocoon, it's basically goo, except for their imaginal cells. So how do you allow for the person's gooey state, and then access the imaginal cells? And I think that's the thing that I love about psychology is it offers metaphors with which to get optimistic, which is this idea of, you know, Norman Cousins, that civilization begins in the imagination. And he also said we should never underestimate the issues that we face, but also we should never underestimate our abilities to deal with them. So that's usually the space that I hold with people when I see them in that state, but I'm also very validating of it because it is big.
I love that. Yeah. I forgot about goo. Thank you for bringing that up. I actually was in San Francisco walking through the dog patch with my friend Sarah Owens, and she said, just randomly, she looked at me and she said, "Do you know what happens to a caterpillar when they go into their cocoon?" I said, "No, what?" And she looked at me shocked and she said, "They become goo. Goo." I will never forget. I remember exactly where we were standing, the light. I just remember her amazement that they become goo. And yes, it is a total disintegration. Maybe that's what. So, okay, there's another parallel path here. If I stay with Christina Groff to birth, Stan Groff charted the four stages of birth for the baby. And stage one, you're floating in amniotic fluid. It's blissful. It's so wonderful, assuming that the mother is taken care of and supported. Stage two is the baby is growing, but the size of the baby's environment is not growing. And this is before birth, where the environment actually begins to seem like it might crush the baby. And this is before the cervix has begun to dilate. And this is when the baby knows that it needs an exit, but it can't find one. And this is a moment of terror. This is the no exit situation, which we've talked about with Star Trek. We have to come back to that story. We have got to, you know, that the
yeah.
Kobayashi Maru. Yeah. So fun. Okay. This is really great getting to hop from thing to thing. So in the birth, stage two is, how do you deal with no exit? What happens to your animal body? What happens to you as a person when you're in a situation where if the baby keeps growing, the baby will be crushed. And there's no exit for the baby to find. And the way through is actually to fully accept hopelessness. So coming back to this idea of the imaginal cells, and it's just to surrender, or not the imaginal cells, the goo, right?
Okay.
To fully surrender. And then in stage three is when the cervix begins to dilate, and then there's a way through. But the Kobayashi Maru, can you tell this story? It's such a good one.
Well, so years ago, I mean, now it's become very popularized, but years ago, when I was teaching, I do these brown bag little workshops for IT guys in various companies in the Bay Area, and inevitably, they're the ones that get the brunt of all the sort of verbal abuse, because there's someone working on their computer and they can't get it to work, and they're just like, how come you can't help me? And there's just they deal with a lot. So I said, oftentimes it feels like you're in a Kobayashi Maru, which is a no-win scenario. And they would just go, "Oh, yes." And she knows Star Trek. It was really funny. How to talk to engineers. And it's the Kobayashi Maru is in the fictional series, I mean, the movies of Star Trek. One of them is that one of the captains, to become a captain, you have to go through this test, which is you're set up in this kind of no-win scenario, and you're basically, what's looked at is how you handle it, right? And so what happens in the movie is that it turns out that Kirk actually figured out a way to dismantle the actual thing so that he could win. But
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
Can I jump in? Okay, just to tie up a few things. So let's imagine you are a captain on a ship, and this is your final test before you graduate. And you have two options. One is to save a ship in distress, but everybody on your crew will be killed. Or the other is to leave the ship in distress, but everybody on the other ship will be killed. Is that a good
That could be
example?
a Kobayashi Maru. Yeah. I don't actually know what they don't really say what it is, but it's basically a scenario where you just can't win.
Yeah.
Just can't win.
Either way, someone in that
Either way,
situation.
something bad happens, right?
Yes.
And so it's like, maybe, you know, if you have to choose between the mother and the child when the child's being born, or, I mean, just basically no-win scenarios. And the idea is that you look at the person, the way they handled it, right? So in this case, it almost looks like we're in a Kobayashi Maru. There's no way to win because we have all this adversity coming up. And yet we have these governments that have been put into place that don't really get it. And so what do we do about it? And however, that might be the goo state, and that we just need to access our imaginal selves and think outside the box, which I think is what's possible now with AI and other people kind of putting their minds to it. And I think that's why I wanted to do this podcast. So I want to know what other people's imaginal selves are saying so that we can build a collective intelligence about how to get there. You know?
Okay, thank you for going down the road of the Kobayashi Maru. I'm very satisfied with this conversation because we've unlocked but it's a good question, how I've thought about it for myself. I've been in situations in where you've said you're in a Kobayashi Maru, and I thought, I hate this. I am.
Yeah.
And what do you do? What do you do? All right. So building on this, what is the role of thinking good thoughts?
I think that is the key, really, is, like what, good or creative or something solution, right? And I know that when they teach you how to ride mountain bikes, one of the things they say is don't look where you don't want to go. Look where you want to go, and your body will take you there. And I think the idea is to set your vision, set your sights on something so that your body will take you there. And I think that's what we need to do, is figure out how to get a collective understanding of how life could be better, how humans could live in harmony with nature and still, be okay.
And I would say that I'm daring to say that the collective intelligence starts with first figuring it out for ourselves. So you wrote in the book, when we realize that life is a mirror, we stop reaching outward to change the reflection and turn to ourselves. It is there that we can actually affect change. How do we stop watching the nightmare internally, personally? It's, like the idea of, if you think all the time about fill in the blank, you're probably going to get more of fill in the blank, whatever that happens to be.
Well, that specific realization came from my understanding about misogyny, that I couldn't have any effect on anybody until I dealt with my own internal misogynist, which was pretty powerful. And I realized that I was treating myself poorly. And as a result, I was very disempowered by that. So I had to deal with that first. So I had to go internal. And I found out that I kept trying to change the people around me. I kept trying to change my dad or the men that I dated. Or I was like, change. And that's like trying to change the movie on the wall as opposed to going back to the actual film and editing the film, right? So to me, the internal misogynist was the place that I started with that. And I think that we all need to take a look at that part of us that's terrified of survival and what we're, what happens when we get in that state. We become very much more animalistic, more lizard-like. And I think that's one of the wisest things that Gerald Barney talked about, was that, he had this example of this little girl and the ick people.
Okay. Before you say it, I have to interrupt.
Yeah.
Gerald Barney had such an impact on Susie that for our book that we co-wrote together, Your Story is Your Power, Free Your Feminine Voice, Susie said, what if we dedicate the book to Gerald Barney? And she's about to tell, and we did. So if you get that book or if you have it and you look in the cover, it's dedicated to this guy, and she's about to tell you the story of why. Okay, go ahead.
So yeah, Gerald Barney was the guy that wrote the Global 2000 report for President Carter at the time. And so he was seeped in all of this stuff, seeped in, this very sober space and I think very, depressed by it. And he did a presentation at the Parliament of World Religions in South Africa. And he, in his presentation, he talked about this young girl who was very kind. She wasn't particularly brilliant or smart, but she was very kind. And she was always trying to be very generous and helpful. And she was in a tribe of people that were starving. And people would laugh at her and kick her, and so, but she would try to find little pieces of things on the ground to eat, or, hug people or whatever, because she was trying to make a bid for contact and, do something good for everyone. And her parents, who were in that state, that I would say lizard brain state, just found her annoying. So they threw her basically in the hut and closed the door. And she was not strong enough to open the door and eventually died in the hut. And his conclusion was that he didn't want the world to get to the place where we would do that kind of thing, not see that, and not have that interaction of cooperation or loving or whatever, that was not the focal point. It was, they were so much in survival they couldn't see it. And I was just reading on Facebook, a friend of mine who lives in a neighborhood where the fires are, and she said her house has survived because her neighbors went and watered her house down.
Hmm.
And that, to me, is the most beautiful thing about humans, right? Is how do we foster that? How do we, build a society where that sort of thing happens? And I think when humans are faced with scarcity, they kind of go crazy. And, our country is just laden with riches, but yet people still feel scarcity. And I could go on about why I think that is and blame it on the corporations and advertising, but I won't go there. But to say that the psychology that I think that he was talking about is he didn't want the world to get to the point where we would just do that. And there's some, horrible things that people do to people in the world. And I'm not sure really how to intervene on that, but to start that way, to set up environments so that doesn't happen.
Susie, what I've gotten from you over the years is that as we grow up, we are impacted culturally, we're impacted by advertising, as you mentioned. One of the examples we talk about often, and we shared in our talk for Your Story Is Your Power, is how women largely didn't smoke. They didn't smoke
Yes.
cigarettes, and then the cigarette companies realized that if they could have advertising that appealed more to women, that they would be able to increase their sales of cigarettes if women started smoking. And they were able to successfully do that with a campaign. And they just used psychology. What
It was
it?
Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew, that did that.
And what was the slogan?
It was coining the cigarette as the torches of freedom.
Torches of freedom. That if you were to smoke cigarettes and you were, out being seen with this cigarette, that you would be seen in this way, and it would reflect on your identity as a person.
No.
So, yes, we have all been influenced socially, culturally, advertising, our families, the schools that we went to, everything that we were raised with. And in the book, Your Story Is Your Power, we talk through all kinds of questions that you can ask if you're curious to peel back those layers more. But there's a quote. It's when you know better, do better. And this idea that as you begin to peel back the layers of all of the different things that have influenced and shaped you, then you can get a really good look at yourself. And, that's one of the chapters in your book is the mirror. And you wrote in your book, I know so many of these lines by heart. When one gets a really good look at oneself, they're goaded into action. And this idea that from that point on, you're no longer trying to change the mirror, so to speak, as you write about. It's more about doing the work personally. And when you know better, do better. And to start stepping toward the world you want to live in, the movie you want to be watching, to take responsibility for that. And there's something in your kitchen that I want to talk about. It's a gift I gave you. So Susie has a favorite movie. It's also a favorite movie of mine. And I don't remember what holiday it was. Was it?
It was
I don't know what
Christmas
holiday
or
it was.
birthday. I think you gave it to me. I can't remember.
So I gave Susie this little board, like a little wooden board that I painted. And it was painted in blue and purple. I mean, purple and green, because it's from a scene in a movie. And it was for her kitchen because that's the scene it's in the movie. And it says Timus Noske. And it's hanging, I think, in
Yeah,
Susie's
it's in my
kitchen
kitchen.
now. And Susie, tell us what kitchen that was from in the film and why I might have given you that gift.
So it's Temet Noske, and it's from The Matrix. And there's a scene
Woohoo!
with Neo, and Neo is discovering that he's more than what meets the eye. There's something more to him, like he has some kind of destiny. And there's an oracle that he meets, and she's baking cookies. And there's a lot of wisdom that goes on that. But the key thing is she says, do you know what that sign up means up there? And she had mentioned that he was struggling with this idea of fate and having your own agency. Like, are you stuck in fate, or what is it? Can I change fate or not? And then she points to this sign and says, you know what that means? And he says, no. And she said, it means to know thyself. And I think that's one of the most powerful statements we have, is you really know yourself. And I think that as therapists, we know the deeper we go into the self, the more agency we have and the more ability we have to navigate the world. The more that we know ourselves, the more we find that internal coherence, as Daniel Sieg would say. Yeah. But I'm also struck too by this, in your book, Crossroads of Should and Must. I think globally we're at that crossroads. It's such a fabulous metaphor.
Hmm.
And I think the shoulds are, you should be doing things for your own survival, which yes and no, but the must is we need to figure out collectively how we're going to do this. So how
The
do
must is the question at the death cafe.
Exactly.
There's so many things, that you can do, or you could do, you should do. And then there's something that's choiceless. And Deb Ozarko would use the word soul. And I've been thinking a lot about soul, and is it scientifically proven, and what is a soul, and can the academic part of me wrap my head around the proof of a soul? And I read this wonderful book that gave me an answer. It's called Rosalie Lightning by Tom Hart. And he's an amazing cartoonist, and his daughter passed away. His daughter had sudden infant death syndrome, and he wrote a book about it. Beautiful book. And in that book, he realized after his daughter died that he wasn't sure how he felt about a soul. But then he realized that for him to go on living, for him to be able to survive the death of his daughter, he had to believe in it. He just had to. He didn't need proof. He didn't need academic papers, he just, for the survival of his own being, he had to believe that she was available, that she was there, that he could talk to her. And I loved that so much. So I'm going to borrow that from Tom Hart.
Yeah.
And this idea of a soul. And I think that must is the soul. I think that maybe Deb Ozarko is headed that way of, if you had 3 more months, what would you do? And can you go do that thing?
Yeah.
What is it that's choiceless, that's unavoidable, that has to happen? And what if we all did that? What if we all took more time to do that? And I think that's what's so great about near-death experiences is a lot of people, from what I'm learning, I have not had a near-death experience. I think I've had a shared death experience when Tilly died, but I haven't had a near-death experience. And what I'm getting is that after people have these near-death experiences, they come back and their priorities are different. They come back here and they are no longer afraid of dying. It actually seems like they're more afraid of being here than they are of dying. Yeah. It's a rough
Some
place
of them
to
say
be.
it's much easier to die than it is to come back to life.
Yeah. Yeah. Who was the recent neurosurgeon? That was such a great one that you sent me. She was I think a spine surgeon.
Yeah. It'll come to me. Mary something. Yeah, hers was amazing. Where she was kayaking and was dead for like 30 minutes or something like that. Yeah. She's
Right. And there was
yeah,
no brain activity.
nothing.
And because some people say that a near-death experience is just your brain getting depleted of oxygen. And here was a trained doctor saying, nope, I was brain dead. It was game over. And she came back from death. And to hear her talk about that experience and how it's changed her, wow. I mean, those stories give me a lot of hope listening to the YouTube, and I know you listen to them all the
Well, that
time.
was one of the when I was meditating. Well, this is what I wanted to go back to before I forget is the idea of the white or the tabla rasa room, the white
Mm,
room that you have in Crossroads. And I was thinking about the goo and that moment of sobriety, like all of that, I think is the white room because, or that moment where you just release, like if there's no way out. And it's this sense of,
mm.
wow, I'm in this completely, you know, unmovable state. And I can't will myself to not be an alcoholic, or I can't will something to happen. So what do I do? And we all, I think, go into that goo space. And the white room is, I think, that space.
For those of you who don't know, the White Room is a room that I had, a dream, a recurring dream that I had about. I would just go into this room with these tall walls and warehouse windows, and I would sit in the middle of this room and be filled with incredible peace. And eventually, I went and found that room in real life. It turns out you can actually look for objects, places, things from your dreams in real life. Life gets very trippy when you start doing that.
Yes.
You can do it. You can do
Yeah.
it. It reminds me of another dream I had, Susie. We've talked a lot about internalized misogyny and our personal journeys, specifically in the book. But one of the big moments that I knew things were changing was when I had a dream where I was in a movie theater, and another great archetypal symbol. I'm in a movie theater and there's a movie playing and there's all this violence against women in the movies. And one by one, women started getting up from the theater and walking out of the movie theater. And I was sitting there and it dawned on me in the dream that I could stand up and I could walk out of the movie theater also. And I did. And I woke up from that dream feeling it was a little bit ahead of me. I don't know that I was walking out of movie theaters metaphorically in my life, but it was a bit of a prelude to what was to come and to how to walk out of movie theaters. Maybe I needed to see it. Maybe dreams are the imaginal selves, right?
Yeah, maybe.
I had to see it in order to even then have that new idea, like, I can actually get up and walk out of this situation or this conversation or this interaction, or, I don't have to sit here. I have agency, right? And we're covering so much ground. I don't even know where the beginning, middle, or end is. But one thing that that must be included in this conversation is what you wrote about in your book about Gandhi and humiliation and the earth. And I
Mhm.
just wanted to make sure that is like a foundational thing, and it's related to the movie theater.
Well, I mean, so much to say about Gandhi. But that insight that he had was that I don't know how many hundreds of millions of Indians were at that time, but there was only like less than 2,000 British ruling that many people. And so he was trying to figure out how did they do that? And because both the English and the British were very classist, the English just basically came in and established themselves at the top of the class because they were white. And so the way that they would maintain that classist system was through the way they did it was through humiliation. And humiliation, having looked it up, is synonymous with shame, to shame someone. And humiliation is literally from the root of humus, which is earth. And so when you want to elevate your elevate your stance in society, and this really comes from feudal times, you'd push someone else to work on the earth, to push them towards the earth, and that would elevate you. So he figured that out, and he figured out that if he didn't cooperate with the humiliation, they would have no power. So his first principle of nonviolence, nonviolent action, is the non-cooperation with anything humiliating. And that blew my mind because I realized that I was humiliating myself through the internal misogyny, and that I literally had to fire my internal misogynist because it was so into shaming me, and I was no longer going to allow shame inside of me. And that totally changed my life. And I really, my hat is off to Gandhi for figuring this out, because he did do an amazing campaign where he refused to shame people, refused to hate them. He, one of the things that one of the moments in time that I was privileged to hear some interesting stories about Gandhi that nobody knew was I was in Tibet and I was sitting in this restaurant, and there was this guy there that happened to be someone who was born in Shanghai and then raised in Kentucky and then educated at Oxford in religion, and then became a professor of religion, and then ended up in whatever school is in Vancouver, whatever that school is in British Columbia, Canada. And he was interested in writing about Gandhi, Lao Tzu, and Jesus. That was his focus. And he had, the chancellor of the school was this guy, it was Lord Mountbatten. And Lord Mountbatten was the last viceroy to India and knew Gandhi and spent a lot of time with him. And so he sought to get a interview with him, and it took him 3 years. And then he finally got an interview with him, and he wanted to just get some tidbits from him about Gandhi. And he told him a lot of stories. And so he told me a lot of the stories, and a lot of the stories I knew already. But one he told me that I had never heard. And there was that when Mountbatten was first, taken out of England and said, hey, can we put you in? Well, actually, he was in Ireland. But anyway, he was asked to be the last viceroy and to figure out how to extricate the United Kingdom from India. And so the first thing he did when he got to India was to summon Gandhi. So he sent Gandhi a plane, but Gandhi refused a plane because in his realm, anything that the British did that would humiliate another industry of India, he was not interested in, right? Because that was just making them poorer and poorer. So he refused the plane, and then became like third-class sleeper on a train to Delhi. And then Mountbatten sent him a car. He refused the car, and Gandhi walked to the palace. And I've been to that area in Delhi where this palace is. It's very spacious. So I sort of imagine this little guy in a, this little rag thing, and was, walking up with his cane. But anyway, he came to
His
have
tiffin box.
His tiffin box, right? So, and then Mountbatten invited him to lunch. He says, "Well, I have my own lunch." And he, okay. And so then, but he sat down and he started to cry. Gandhi started to cry. And Mountbatten said, "Why are you crying?" Now, at this point, I'm thinking, why is he crying? I'm so interested. And he said, "Well, I've lost my watch." And I thought, oh, is it that watch that, that guy in South Africa gave him? And how these stories made up on why he was crying. And Mountbatten says, "Well, we can get you another watch or get you a watch back." And he said, "No, that's not why I'm crying. I'm crying because for just a moment, I lost faith in humanity." So here's a guy that meditated on the goodness of humanity and believed that humans were good. They could do bad things. They could do evil things, but they were good ultimately. And he meditated on that and really believed it at his core. So for just a flick of a moment when he didn't feel that way, it was so disturbing that it made him cry. So his work, I think, is very interesting because we can take a look at how we're easily manipulated,
Mm-hmm.
And how we can get, the part of us that wants to be, big in society or big in life, or feels like our survival is based on our social interaction. If you get humiliated, it's very disturbing because it feels like you're going to die. So Gandhi figured out a way to circumnavigate that so you don't have to do that.
I'm still really sitting with this idea that about survival and about how really getting curious about how we are in moments of scarcity.
Yeah. Well, I think it's that, and I think this is that Gerald Barney figured out, which is that if humans are stuck in a place of scarcity, they do evil things out of fear.
Yeah. Thank you for telling the story about Gandhi. That's one of the stories that you wrote about that has really stuck with me. And Gandhi's first law of nonviolence, non-cooperation with anything humiliating.
Yeah. So he
And
refused to do that. People say, "Oh, don't you think this person's evil?" And he says, "I don't think anybody's evil. I think there are evil laws that people do evil things." So I looked up evil to try to understand what evil is. And it means someone who's intending harm. So it made it more specific about what that was.
it reminds me of the physicist David Bohm. And I cannot remember the context. It was a conference, and somebody said, "Do you think so and so is evil?
No, do you think that competition is evil?
Do you think competition is evil?" And he said, "I don't think it's evil. I just think it's a mistake."
Yeah, it's just a mistake. Yeah. And I think that ties into people that have near-death experiences, is they come back not competitive. They just don't have that drive. And there's something to that. I think naturally we're not. I think naturally we're different than this, you know, vying for power and dominance. There's a different thing about humans that we're needing to cultivate now.
You're here. One of the last quotes in your book is from Matthew 7:7.
Huh.
"Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you." Do you think that this moment of time, we've called it a bottleneck, is that door?
It's interesting, the bottleneck, because it does relate to the birth canal, doesn't it? Hmm. Yeah. That quote, I think, I was raised in a community where we studied the Bible. We studied all different religions, and I got all these um, got great access to information like that. And it's also a quote at the end of one of my books, my favorite books. But in particular, I think that what we forget, this also comes from studying near-death experiences, which is oftentimes when people have a negative near-death experience, they'll be in this place of like people trying to get stuff from them and not knowing where to go and feeling really weird. And then if they pray for help, help comes and they go into a better place. And I think that as we navigate this, to not forget to ask for help from each other. That's why I want to do the podcast, is that it's a grand plan to start to think about what could be a better future. And we need all the minds on it that we have. So this idea of, and I love, there's a woman that Anthony Shane interviews, and Matthew Fox has had time with her too, which she has this experience of seeing angels in Ireland. She's an Irish woman, and she said there's a lot of unemployed angels out there. And I love that. I don't know if it's real. I think it's real, but I don't know. It's a hypothesis that I really like. And one of my teachers when I was growing up used to say, choose the nobler hypothesis. Now I know that, people that are scientists, that's sort of cringeworthy because you want to choose the right hypothesis. But when there's a hypothesis out there and you just don't know, the nobler one seems really appealing. So I find this idea of unemployed angels is appealing because we could use them right now. And this idea that if we ask for help, and a lot of times you talk to people that are in recovery, right, in AA and NAA and all that, and they get to the point where they just have to relax and go, you know what, I just need to ask for help.
It reminds me of Ram Dass. He was going to write a book, or he did write a book, I don't know, that said, "How can I help you?" And then he had a stroke and he laughed because the title of his book needed to be How You Can Help Me. Oh, will you help me?
Will you help me? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
he's so interesting. I before he died, I got to see him a bunch of times, but uh, one time he talked about how his guru, whose name I can never quite say,
Maharaji.
no, Kareem Nuruli Baba or something like that. But anyway, he said to him, go back and feed people. And I thought, wow, that's such a great sentence, right? Because I felt so fed by what he was saying. It's just like so nourishing, all the stuff that comes out of him, but also, literally feeding people.
Hmm.
And that's such a loving thing to do, right? To feed people. And that's also part of what we need, is how to help feed each other. Because they say hell is, people with long spoons trying to eat, but actually heaven is when they serve the long spoon to somebody else and they can all feed, you know. And I think we're at that point now where we have to start using long spoons to feed each other. I think that's hard. Letting go. I think this is one of the things I think is important to understand, because letting go is very complex, especially when it's something that you think you need to survive, right? So, I don't think when people just say, "Oh, just let it go," I think that it's a very big thing to ask somebody. But this idea of when you say, okay, this could be hospice, or we could just be waiting for our next chemotherapy, or this could be, we're going to heal ourselves with, immunotherapy, whatever. The idea is that how do we let go of the attachment to certain things and basically be sober about, understanding or accepting the reality as it is, because that's the first step. A lot of my students used to say the first step in getting therapy is coming to the point where you have to accept the reality that you're in.
Hmm.
And at the same time, this idea of accepting the reality that you're in, also then when you know what your problem is, and this is also like looking in a mirror, like when you look in the mirror and you go, oh yeah, okay, I can see that I need to tweeze my eyebrows here, or lose 5 pounds here, or get new shoes. It can goad me into action to saying, okay, I can do something, right? And so this idea of letting go, I think and I think this is why studying personality typologies like the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs is that you take a look at what the personality is clinging on to and what's stopping you, right? And so letting those things go is it's hard, but it's so fulfilling.
And one of the analogies you've used over time is that letting go is a little bit like, imagine your fist clinging to a golf ball or a ball of any kind, and the personality is fixating on something, which is the golf ball.
The pearl.
And the pearl. And oh yeah, the claw and the pearl. Thank you. Yes. So the claw is wrapped really tightly around the pearl. And if you want to release the personality, if you want to release the claw, one way to do it is to just rip the fingers back because they're so rigidly holding on to that pearl. And if you do that, you break all the fingers. It's a big mess. The other way to do it is to massage the wrist. And when you massage the wrist, the fingers naturally relax, the hand opens, and the pearl emerges.
Well, and I think that this is this grasping of the pearl. What happens is you don't get to see the pearl if you hang on to it, right? And I had this thought when I was in China. There's all these, dragons holding pearls and things like that, right? And this idea that the reason the person's grasping is because the belief is, if I don't keep a strong hold on it, it's going to go away. And so that's the place of deficit. And it's the imagination, it's the ability to see beyond what is into what could be, right? Is that massage, because the person delights in looking at what's possible, right? And yet, you look at Gene Roddenberry, who started Star Trek, who's the person who wrote Star Trek, and how much has come from that show in the 60s. It's just extraordinary. And I love this story, and I'm going to say the story because we talked about Gandhi, and I think Martin Luther King needs a little airtime. But Nichelle Nichols was going to quit Star Trek, and then she ended up at this party where she runs into.
Susie, sorry, I'm not a Star Trek. Can you just decide,
Sure.
explain who those people are?
So Nichelle Nichols is the woman who played Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek, and Lieutenant Uhura was a Black woman playing a communications officer. And at that time, there was really no woman on TV playing that, especially a Black woman. And there was one person that came up to her once and said, I saw you on TV, and I yelled to my mother, "Hey, Ma, there's a Black lady on TV and she's not playing a maid." And I knew from then on I could do anything. And that was Whoopi Goldberg. I love that story. And this particular moment, she was going to quit Star Trek. And Roddenberry was saying, you're changing culture just by being in this role in TV.
Yes.
And she really wanted to go back to musical theater. And she serendipitously got invited to a party, and there was a fan there, and started saying, "You can't leave. You can't leave. This is the only show that my wife will let my kids watch. And it's my favorite show," and da-da-da-da. And it turned out to be Martin Luther King. And I get such glee out of knowing that Martin Luther King was a Trekkie. Yeah. But in a way, I think it's like we all need that vision. And to have a vision of the future where there's no war, there's no hunger, and we don't use money anymore. It's like having that as a possibility put out there. It's like that, that imaginal cell that Roddenberry gave to us. It's fed so many people's imaginations,
Yes.
And that's what I think is like, how do we help each other with our lighting up our imaginal cells?
Okay, well, the last thing that I have on my list here, and I realize I don't even know if we went through all of your questions. We've been talking for almost 2 hours. So we probably should wrap it up soon. But I did have one other thing. I wanted to just talk about manifestation. Is this a good place to land, or do you have another question before we get there?
Well, like a lot of pursuits I have in life, one of them I have discovered anecdotally to be very successful is manifestation. And I've actually heard Jennifer Aniston talk about this very thing. She actually does something very similar, which is when you write something down or you imagine something as if it's already happened, it comes to fruition. And it's amazing. And
but it's so for those of you who want to do it, you write it down as if it's already happened in the past tense. And it has to all be in the positive. It can't be like this didn't happen, or you can't focus on what you don't want to happen. You have to keep it focused on what you do. And then how many times a day do they have to read it for how many days?
Well, so I was taught to read it out loud. Now, reading out loud, I was trying to figure out why that was important. And as a therapist, I know that when you say things out loud, it actually gets your neural nets to fire as if that's already happening, right? Because your mind doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's not real. It'll just build these neural nets anyway.
This is why you shouldn't watch violent movies.
Exactly.
The brain does not know that you are not in the middle of a war.
Right.
Right.
And so that was very useful, I thought. And I found, so I did it in different increments, but one of the more powerful ones was when I found my spouse, and I read it out loud for 7 times a day for 7 days. And as I was reading it out loud, I would weep, especially for the first 3 or 4 days, because I felt like I didn't deserve to have it. But then I got used to saying it so much that I just lost that sense. And then I met my spouse. And I think that what happens is that we can see things we think are possible. And so when you get your mind wrapped around that, then it might happen, right? And I think that's what we all need to do now, is start writing that manifestation list, right? Because I want to see the possibility of, that utopian future where we can live in harmony with nature. I love having solar panels on my house that generate my car, and I don't buy gas, and I just use the electric vehicle and drive around. And sometimes when we go on trips, we have to do stuff like that. We have to charge, but generally my car is now just purely solar run, and so is all my electricity. And that
Was that on
just
your
makes me
manifestation
so,
list?
yeah, exactly. It's
I,
like,
I do have to say though that it takes guts to even write your manifestation list, because I want to highlight or underline, like triple underline what you said. The first few days you didn't feel like you deserved it. When you sit down to write your dreams, or to really write honestly with yourself what you really hope will happen, and to really feel into that, there's usually a lot of sadness because you want it so much. And it's such a feeling oriented thing. And for some reason it feels like it's not happening. But yes, it takes a lot to sit down and really write down what you want, and to feel it, and then to write it in the past tense like it's already happened. But you've described to me that the neuroplasticity is actually at work, and it's
yes,
actually, bridging to this idea of these imaginal cells, that what's actually happening is you're slowly rewiring, or creating new wires in your brain to imagine how it would be possible. And you almost have to know what you're looking for in order to even see it at all. And one of the stories that we've talked about before is, if you have a deck of cards, well, which card are you looking for? I'm looking for the 7 of clubs. Well, why does that matter if I'm looking for the 7 of clubs? Because then you'll actually know it when you see it, as opposed to just seeing all of the cards, right? It's like in Alice in Wonderland, when she's walking down the road and she comes across the caterpillar, and he says, which way are you going? And she says, I don't very much care. And he says, well, then it doesn't matter which road you take. So this idea, coming full circle, the name of the podcast is Into the Diamond Sun, right? Did I get that right?
yeah. But before you go there, there's one thing I want to
Okay.
say. First of all, that the card thing. The card
Mm.
thing I started doing with solitaire to practice manifesting. So I practiced manifesting the card that I needed. But what I noticed is, even if I thought of the card, it didn't come up right away, but it enabled me to see the card more when it appeared. That was why that was so significant. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is that, looking at this podcast possibility and all that, what keeps you magically here and interested in doing it?
Yeah. I think it goes back to this, where we started. Um, I'm reading, this book about beyond hope. I think personally, I'm having a real moment of sobriety, of just, there's just a lot of grief that's coming up about where we are. And, I'm tracking everything that's happening with artificial intelligence. Things are speeding up, they're moving quicker. And the window of possibility feels, for the first time ever in my life, like it actually has some edges to it. It's not limitless. Like it's not inevitable that we are going to make it through. I think I am starting to understand how heartbreak is an essential part of taking action, or how, um, yeah, really feeling what comes up, um, when I'm not in denial about what's going on.
Yeah.
And talking to really smart people who have found a coherent way to live with that understanding. And the people who we've talked to are so joyful.
Yeah.
And there is a freedom that comes on the other side of this acceptance that I'm just now starting to feel. And but I think going all the way through that, um, process, which I'm still in, I'm a bit in the goo stage. I, yeah, I want to see other butterflies.
And I just want to sing your praises here for a minute, if I can, which is that, and this is why I choose you in this endeavor because you are adept at discovery and creativity. You're adept at stepping into the tabula rasa and really working with the elements that you have and thinking about it and working about it with it from both sides of your brain and all that you have. And you come out with such beauty and such tangible exquisiteness. I was remembering that when we were with my cousins one night and you were looking at his book and you were just touching it and feeling the fabric of the cover and everything. And you could just see him moved by your ability to really investigate and feel what he had done. And I think that you, of all people, the future is bright because someone like you lives in it.
Thank you, Suze.
And I keep thinking about that dream that I had that we put in the end of your story, which is that, I was in that it was like dark. And I think that's probably what this podcast is really about. I was in that dark place. I was in a dark, somewhere in the northern hemisphere, like Iceland or Scotland or something. And everything was black. Even the sand was black. And there was this boat there. And I stepped into the boat with all these people. And I think it was kind of like one of those old Anglo-Saxon ships or Viking ships. It was long. And we start going out into the water. And I turned to see this huge tsunami coming our way, like huge. And I turned back to the people in the boat and I'm like, there's a huge tsunami. And they're like, no problem. And they maneuvered the boat so it would go under the curl of the wave. And the wave went over and we came out the other side. And to me, that's the hope.
I think that's a wonderful place to land. Thank you, Susie.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Into the Diamond Sun. Please click the like button if you enjoyed this content. It really helps the channel. If you're curious about some of the references, see the show notes for more details. And do hit the subscribe button as well. That also helps the channel. And it lets you catch our future episodes. We both thank you deeply and from our hearts.